Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about the film The King's Speech, which came out in 2010. It's directed by Tom Hooper and written by David Seidler. It shows the lead up to King George VI of England's first wartime speech in 1939 as he works with speech therapist Lionel Logue to overcome his stammer, obviously based on a true story. It won high praise and many awards. It got 12 Oscar nominations, more than any other film that year, and it won 4, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Colin Firth. And there's some additional reading. There was a book that was in the works when the movie was being made, but it hadn't been published yet. It's called The King's Speech by Mark Logue, who is Lionel Logue's grandson, and Peter Conradi. What did you think of this movie?
I enjoyed this movie. I'd seen it before, probably like you when it came out, so a while ago. It's one of those biopics that I enjoy more than most. I think it's a really kind of strangely feel-good movie to watch. When we're talking about the British monarchy, there's a lot you can say about it, but this really wasn't too much about the actual politics involved. I found it's mostly just about the people as people. I don't know how realistic I think it is, but I did enjoy it as a movie. How about you?
Yeah, I think the acting is great. Obviously, of Colin Firth and Jeffrey Rush as the leading men, and they're both absolutely incredible. It goes along at a pretty good pace. I like that it focuses on the relationship between these two guys because I feel like that's very strong. I do find that it's kind of in the vein of these movies that are like, the British monarchy is so inspiring, nothing further. Anyway, and like I personally, I mean, if anyone's listened to this podcast for longer than like 10 minutes, you can probably guess that I think we should abolish the monarchy. I think that, just watching this movie and reading about these monarchs, I'm like, wow, the profound mediocrity. People who are born into becoming leaders of men. I do like the aspect of it where it's this friendship between these two guys, and one of them is helping the other one to overcome something. There's some really kind of sweet scenes between them. I quite enjoyed that, but I do think, if I take even one little step back and consider that it's about the British monarchy, I'm like, okay, well,
I will say I read this book not in its entirety, but it's full of Lionel Logue's diary entries made into a good narrative, so the book is really fun to read. I do feel like they smartly used this relationship that was fairly close, but it was very different to what we see in the movie, in the sense that, for instance, Lionel Logue calls him Bertie in the movie. He did not in real life get that familiar with him. So I feel like they took some liberties in the way they worked together and made that into a little bit of a closer relationship maybe than it had been in real life, but not in a way necessarily that I mind, but it's done on purpose, obviously.
yeah, I think it works. I think with that one in particular, the fact that he calls him Bertie the whole movie, and then right at the end, he calls him Your Majesty or whatever he says, that's a way for Lionel Logue to express, like, yeah, like you've done it now. You've stepped into those shoes. You deserve to be king, like we always talked about. You've done the thing.
Yeah, I agree, and you do see, even in the book, he's so proud of this man, and he just wants this man to succeed as a human being rather than as this kind of larger than life monarch. It feels like an honest relationship between two men. It doesn't feel like a relationship between a commoner and a monarch so much, which is what I enjoyed from the book quite a lot.
Yeah, another thing I like too, and maybe this is just my own personal bias because we have a World War II podcast, but I did like how they framed it around the lead up to World War II. And this massive speech that he has to give is the one where he's addressing the nation right after Great Britain has declared war on Germany. And I think it really works that he's developing and evolving as a person right at the moment where he is going to have to step up and the country's being thrown into tumult. I feel like they had his life and kind of what's happening with the country reflected really well against each other.
Very true. And it's an interesting conversation to have, I think, maybe at the end of the podcast as we near that moment, about the way I think, in a way, the war saved the British monarchy a bit. Because They needed a symbol of hope after a rather tumultuous time and like scandal and all that. And then the war happened and they needed someone to depend on. And I think he really was that man for Britain in the war, which is lucky for him because he didn't want to be king. Like he just was kind of forced into it in a way because of circumstances. And I think had his role been a different kind of role than a like support in a ward would have been much more difficult for him.
Would like to say that King George VI has actually been to my hometown. When him and his wife traveled Canada in 1939, they came here. We still have a local park named after them. They did this like little ceremony there, and they actually went down into the mines. Yeah, I thought that was neat.
Cool, let's get into the plot. We start, as is customary at this point, with an opening card. It says 1925. King George V reigns over a quarter of the world's people. He asks his second son, the Duke of York, to give the closing speech of the Empire Exhibition in Wembley, London. The speech goes rather poorly, as the Duke, played by Colin Firth, who's known as Bertie to his family, has a very strong stammer and he really struggles to give this speech. He has seen a number of doctors with the support of his wife, Elizabeth, played by Helena Bonham Carter. None of them have succeeded in helping him get over the stammer, and the one where they put pebbles in his mouth actually came from ancient Greece, because apparently that was a cure at one time, and it's actually really ridiculous.
Yeah, it's very silly. I was like, he's definitely gonna swallow one of those marbles, and then he did.
Yeah, I really like Helena Bonham Carter in this role, by the way. She's really good too. I feel like every single actor is good in this.
This is a role that perfectly suits her. I mean, she also played Margaret on The Crown, and I feel like it was she got to recycle this accent.
Yes.
As they say in the movie, 150 years earlier, all the people would expect of the king is not to fall off his horse. But now that the royal family has to give all of these speeches and these things are being broadcast over the radio, etc., then, obviously it's a lot more nerve wracking giving a speech that, millions of people are going to hear versus, the 10 people standing nearest to you. So this is a big deal for this man in a way that it would not have been for monarchs who were born even, 50 years before him.
Sit on a horse and look pretty is what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Elizabeth visits a local speech therapist, Lionel Logue, played by Jeffrey Rush. He's very charming and likable in this movie. She doesn't tell her husband that she's going because at this point Bertie's had it to the back teeth with all these different treatment methods that he's been subjected to. She attempts to get Lionel to treat her husband at home for obvious reasons, but even once he realizes who she is, he firmly establishes that treatment must occur at his office, and this is a running theme for him where he is the one who sets the rules, and he's very insistent that they're going to treat each other as equals and that Bertie's going to do what Lionel tells him to do. And she ultimately agrees, and she manages to persuade Bertie to come and see him.
So in real life, I don't think Elizabeth set this up. It isn't in the book, so I'm guessing that's not exactly what happened. But Lionel Logue did insist that therapy happens either at his office or actually at his house. So I like that they kept that in there.
In one of the documentaries that I watched, they were talking about how Bertie and Elizabeth had gone to the theater and they went backstage and met the cast. And there was this one actress who had had a speech impediment, and she was talking about how great this Lionel Logue guy was.
Yeah, that's in the book as well. So, but I don't think it was like Elizabeth that went to see him behind her husband's back, but she did set it up in a way. Lionel Logue being Australian, I wish they'd given Jeffrey Rush a stronger accent in the movie. I would have enjoyed like a thick Australian accent, but none of that was happening in the movie.
Yeah, they keep mentioning he's Australian, and I'm like, well, he doesn't sound Australian.
So, can I just speak very briefly about how awesome Lionel Logue and his wife are? Because before all this, they went on a world tour just by themselves. They'd had kids, they left their kids in Australia with their, I think, her parents. And they were like, we're just gonna go on a world tour. We're just gonna go through Europe. They've been to Canada, they've been everywhere. And they are so cool. And Lionel Logue was actually a fairly successful and well-known man in Australia, but not so much in England. So he didn't have that much success. But I just really like this adventurous family. And unlike in the movie, Lionel doesn't keep it secret from his wife that he's treating the king in real life. So I don't know why they did that in the movie, maybe to make it a little bit more exciting. But she knew that he was doing this, and she nabbed him on various occasions.
I love how wild his background is too. Like he grows up in Australia and then he decides he wants to be an actor, so he takes elocution lessons with this guy who's like famous for teaching that. And then he starts to work for him and he starts teaching people like elocution lessons, and then that kind of morphs into what he does during World War One, where there's a lot of people with PTSD, as we would call it today, who have speech issues. So he's figuring out all these methods to help them with that. And everyone said his methods were really unique, but also that pretty much the cornerstone of his whole method was like kindness and humor and empathy. Like he didn't want people to feel that that they were being yelled at or that they were being rushed or whatever. And apparently it was really effective. So then he just shows up in London and he's like, yeah, I'm a speech therapist now.
They were talking about in the book how he'd set up his own company of speech therapists, and then one of the other people that also went there decided to start a pyramid scheme for speech therapy. And they were like, I get all these clients, and then all the clients have to also start teaching, and then those clients have to start teaching, and then he was making money off all of them. And Lionel Logue did not enjoy this whatsoever. He got so mad. Bertie is initially resistant to Lionel's methods, and he also does not really want to be there because nothing has worked for him yet, and he doesn't see why this should. And then at the end of their session, Lionel has him recite Shakespeare while listening to loud classical music. And while he's doing that, he's able to speak perfectly, indicating that his speech impediment is likely psychological rather than mechanical, which I think Lionel thinks most of the speech impediments are. But he refuses to listen to the recording. And he has no plans to return to Lionel, but Lionel gives him the recording anyway and says, I give this to everybody, you get to take it home.
Yeah. One of the things that I liked was in the documentary I was watching, they were talking about how George VI was known for having this explosive temper, largely because he stammered and he would just get frustrated. And the way that Colin Firth plays it in the movie is so sympathetic in a way that I am not always when I hear men yelling for no reason.
I think it's because he plays him so quietly, and you can see him struggle so well, and then by the time he gets to yelling, you're like, poor man. It's just really sad that he cannot speak the way he wants to. Another thing I really liked was there's a constant focus, understandably, on Bertie's smoking because his other speech therapists and doctors have told him that smoking relaxes the throat, which it does not really. And it's notable in the movie because that's what eventually kills him because he dies of lung cancer in the end, which is not fun.
Yeah. I think the research on it was still dicey at this point. Like, there was
Mm.
some stuff coming out that smoking was really bad for you, but then obviously the smoking companies were pushing back and being like, "No, we have this other research." But I do remember reading The Outsiders, which was written in the early '50s, and by that point, all the kids were calling cigarettes cancer sticks. So at some point in that, like, 15-year period, I guess they pretty firmly established in the public eye that cigarettes are actually terrible for you.
They are bad. Capital B bad.
But vaping's fine, right?
Absolutely.
1934, a period of time has gone by here. I think it was interesting they did this in the movie to add to the dimension of Bertie and Lionel's relationship because in real life, the first year or so that they knew each other, they met, I think it was 80 times in 14 months. So they were meeting quite often, sometimes more than once a week. And it was very like intensive speech therapy course that Lionel was giving him. And then they kind of separated for a little while. And then when it was time for George to take the throne, they sort of became closer again. And then, after that, Lionel was around quite a lot. But in the movie, they're like, yeah, Bertie tells him to take a hike. And then a bunch of years go by. So now it's 1934. And Bertie's father, King George V, played by Michael Gambon, recites a Christmas message over the radio. He insists that Bertie attempt to read it as well, since the actual heir to the throne, Bertie's older brother David, played by Guy Pearce, has been shirking his responsibilities and someone has to pick up the slack. This is very much an heir and the spare situation, like we had with William and Harry for most of our lives, if you're my age. When Bertie struggles, it becomes apparent by his father's reaction why he stammers so badly because his dad is a dick. And at his wits' end again, Bertie listens to the recording that Lionel had made of him and realizes that Lionel's trick had worked. He'd been able to speak pretty well. So he decides to return to speech therapy. However, he doesn't want to address the root causes of his stammer. He's very much one of those, the royal family does not air their dirty laundry types. And he only wants to focus on the mechanical exercises, which are admittedly very fun and silly. There's lots of doing tongue twisters and yelling swears and doing these odd physical motions.
Yes, I really enjoyed how they showed that in the movie. It's funnily enough not in the book what they do. Like it's mostly Lionel talking about his progress. And at this point in 1934, he was already in real life a decent speaker. Like they'd made so much progress already. But in the movie, we kind of, like you said, they skip a whole bit. And then they're like, oh, we're just, it's been a while since they've seen each other, and now he's only just starting. So they kind of did a switch in the timeline to not give him that progress so quickly and then just start later in the timeline. I think it makes sense because you want to get to that end point of the first wartime speech in a good way, and I think it works.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have any beef with that. I liked that they used his father and brother so effectively because they weren't in a ton of scenes, especially the father, but you just get such a good sense of what their relationship was like. And I think that in real life, I think today, if we saw a child being raised the way George VI was raised, we'd be like, well, that's a little abusive. To be honest, as they discuss in the movie, he was supposed to be left-handed and they punished him until he stopped doing that, which was quite common at the time. He used to wear leg braces. His parents were extremely distant, like they were mostly raised by the staff. Yeah, and I think that initially when he was young, he and his brother got along pretty well. Like his brother was kind of the one who dragged him out of his shell and got him out there to meet the ladies and that kind of stuff. But then as they got older, their personalities were so different that they ended up a little bit at loggerheads a lot of the time. And it's difficult being in a family where you're the shy, retiring one and you stand in everyone else's shadow.
It's also really weird to me that George V was such a dick to his son because apparently he was his favorite. And there's a quote in the book too from him from a letter in which he talks very affectionately about Bertie, and you're like, how do these two different feelings mix? Because they really don't, because he's quite strict. And what you said about the nanny, by the way, it made me laugh because it's so sad that the nanny at the end of the day would present the children to their parents, but then the nanny would like pinch Bertie so he would cry and then would be sent away again. So effectively that's bullying this child that was already like a sensitive boy, and like, why are people like this?
Yeah, I think George V really did think that Bertie would be a better king than his older brother. But it was just that era, where it's like spare the rod, spoil the child type thing. It's like, yeah, you're not supposed to be like a warm, loving father. You're supposed to be the figure of authority. You're supposed to raise your boys to be men.
And they show that quite nicely actually in the movie by having Bertie be so affectionate with his daughters. And then later on, when he gets crowned king, he's no longer really allowed to hug them or anything. And it just made me sad. I mean, I'm sure that's in part what it was like in real life. I've no doubt.
I really liked in the documentary, they mentioned how Bertie used to refer to his wife and daughters as us four. As he would commonly be like, us four are doing this or whatever. And I just like, oh, I'm like, that's so sweet. Like, he genuinely seems like a guy who felt well supported and loved by his family and wanted to be involved in their lives.
Makes you wonder what kind of life he would have had if he had not been made to ascend the throne. I wonder if he would have been a happier man.
Well, I certainly think he would have lived longer.
Yep, me too. It's 1936, so we've moved on 2 years. George V dies, very sadly, after we see him decline fairly quickly, and David becomes King Edward VIII. No one's really impressed by his desire to marry the already twice divorced Wallis Simpson, played by Eve Best. At this point, she's actually still married, I think, to her last husband, but they are getting a divorce. And she's an American socialite, so that's already not, I think, what many people would have wanted for him. Bertie then decides to talk to him about his disregard for his duties, but he struggles to do that, and that's when King Edward cruelly mocks him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I think that David/Edward knows that he's behaving in a way that their father wouldn't approve of, and he's trying to be like, "Yeah, I don't care. I don't care that I'm doing that." And he's trying to make it sound like Bertie is out for his job, and I also think that he knows that that's the last thing that Bertie wants, but he's just very defensive about it.
I don't know what I think about the portrayal of David/Edward in this movie. They chose to show a very narrow view of him, and obviously we do get some of his personality, but I feel like there's a lot more the movie could have told about him, and we'll get to it in a minute, I think. They really chose to focus on Bertie specifically and his relationship with other people, not so much about the other people, so it's a choice.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're really only seeing Edward as he pertains to Bertie's story. Lionel tries to get to the bottom of why Bertie stutters so much when trying to speak candidly with his own brother. Notably, when Bertie's having a calm, normal conversation with his brother, it's fine. But as soon as he gets angry and frustrated with himself, it's just kind of a compounding problem. Like he just gets more and more unable to speak. But Bertie is super stressed out by this whole situation and he gets angry at this perceived crossing of a boundary from Lionel and he calls off their sessions. Lionel attempts to go see him to apologize, but Bertie has staff. And if you have staff, you can just simply refuse to see people.
I don't think this happened in real life. It's not in the book, so I feel like it would have been in the book if this had happened in real life. But I understand they needed more conflict, so I'm not mad.
Yeah, it's drama.
Yep, it is.
Look, we can't just watch a whole movie about ribbon cuttings and hospital openings, okay?
That's fair. I just feel like Lionel and Bertie were just good friends the entire time and they didn't have that much conflict. But I guess it doesn't make for a very good movie.
Listen, I was watching this documentary and they were like, Bertie really liked to visit industrial sites, and he was part of this industrial organization where they talked about industry, and I'm like, "Tedious." Imagine. You're like, "What are you up to today, Bertie?" He's like, "Oh, I'm gonna go visit another fucking factory, gonna take a look at it, gonna talk about industry." Like, yeah, we can't watch a whole movie about that.
You are so right. I will not mention it again. We need conflict in this movie. Bertie's very conflict averse, so they needed to make something up to make it more conflicty.
He's a bit of a weenie in the common parlance.
Yes, it becomes more apparent that Bertie will likely have to be king because Edward is not doing a very good job of pleasing everybody. Winston Churchill, played by Timothy Spall, everyone is in this movie, who is at this point not yet Prime Minister, has to spell it out for him. Not only is Edward insisting on marrying Wallace Simpson, but he also has some Nazi sympathies, which we don't see a whole lot of in the movie. And Britain is on the doorstep of being at war with Germany. Now, Edward then officially, somewhat selfishly, abdicates in the summer of 1936, and Bertie visits Lionel's home to apologize to him as he knows he will need his help now again, as the eye of the nation is on him.
I feel like we've seen so many performances of Churchill by now. How would you rank this?
Not very good. I just, it's kind of comical to me. He's doing a face, and I don't like the face that he's doing, and I don't love it. How about you?
Yeah, it's a bit caricaturish, and I feel like they did the thing again in this movie where they're like, "We'll make Winston Churchill the, like, super cool guy with a twinkle in his eye who," there's just like, I suppose as you said, it's like with, the depiction we get of Edward, it's very one-sided. But yeah, if you wanna listen to our episodes about The Darkest Hour, which is mostly about Churchill, but King George makes an appearance as well, you can go check that out. And I looked into Churchill and Bertie's relationship a little bit because I remember in The Darkest Hour, they did not get along super well initially. Initially, Churchill opposed the abdication of Edward VIII, but he soon realized that the crown was in safer hands with George VI. There's, a statement that he made. He was at the coronation of George VI, and he leaned over to his wife or whoever was sitting next to him, and he was like, "You were right, the other one wouldn't have done." So He came around pretty quickly. And Bertie slash George VI supported Chamberlain's policy of appeasement when it comes to Hitler. And he also later supported Lord Halifax rather than Churchill as Chamberlain's successor in 1940. You can see how they potentially didn't get along in the darkest hour. George VI slash Bertie and Churchill later developed a very close relationship. George was horrified when Churchill lost the post war election, and Churchill noticeably was in his feelings when he gave an address after George's death.
I also liked that when they were having their weekly whatever meetings once Churchill was Prime Minister, they would have tea together and they would excuse all the servants and just serve themselves. And they just had apparently a very fond relationship later on in Churchill's tenure, so it's great. I think that's nice, as far as I think politics can be nice.
Yeah, apparently they spoke quite candidly about the war. Like, George was really on top of wanting to know everything that was happening and reading all the daily briefs and everything.
Yes. It's fun to read about, isn't it? Like this highbrow people doing ordinary people things. So the movie doesn't really go into details about Edward's sympathies for Hitler, but he certainly did have them. And there's an interesting source that you can look up because there are captured German Foreign Ministry archives, which were published largely by the Allies after the war. And so let me read you a couple things that are in these files that are really interesting. In July of 1933, Edward told former Kaiser Wilhelm II's grandson, Louis Ferdinand, that it was, quote, no business of ours to interfere in Germany's internal affairs, either re Jews or re anything else. And then he also said, dictators are very popular these days. We might want one in England before long. So,
Right.
interesting.
Definitely interesting. I went on a little side quest last night because I saw these notes of yours and I was like, I wonder what Kaiser Wilhelm thought about Hitler. Kaiser Wilhelm was the king of Germany who abdicated at the end of World War One, and he was living, I think he was living in the Netherlands at that time. He was in exile, so to speak. And I remember reading that he was pretty appalled by the Night of the Long Knives and Kristallnacht and anything where there was public violence in the streets, but he also was quite anti-Semitic, and he was like, "Maybe if Hitler is able to have an empire, like, we can bring the monarchy back." And he actually used to write to Hitler and be like, "Hey, what if we brought the monarchy back?" And Hitler's like, "This guy's an idiot." Wilhelm died not long after the Germans invaded the Netherlands in 1940. I think he died in 1941, so yeah. So total side quest, but I was just curious. I was like, "Hmm, I wonder what these monarch types think about Hitler."
In 1937, which is a year after Edward abdicated, he and Wallace Simpson together made a very cozy and public visit to Germany, where they were received by Hermann Göring and entertained by him and Hitler at Berchtesgaden, and they apparently had a very long chat with Hitler.
Can I just say nightmare blunt rotation?
Yes, I mean, how can you even like there's photographs and everything of them just having a chummy old time in Germany?
Yeah. If you needed any more evidence that the royal family are and were just profoundly out of touch.
And then in July of 1940, there was an actual SS plot to kidnap Edward. It was called Operation Willy, to kidnap him and hold him in Europe as a potential puppet king for a Nazi-occupied Britain if it ever were to happen. And von Ribbentrop, you might remember that name because we've talked about him before. He was the German foreign minister. Apparently told the German ambassador in Madrid on July 11th of 1940 that, quote, Germany is determined to force England to peace by every means of power, and upon this happening would be prepared to accommodate any desire expressed by the Duke, especially with a view to the assumption of the English throne by the Duke and Duchess. So they were basically saying, look, we'll do anything, even if we have to put Edward back on the throne. And Churchill found out about this and he threatened Edward with a court-martial, and then he sent him to become governor of the Bahamas. And that sounds like a really fancy thing, but it was really as far away from Europe as he could get him. But then the same files that I mentioned before also mentioned that Edward had told Spanish secret agents that continued bombing of London specifically would make Britain ready for peace. So he's
What a
like,
dick.
if you just bomb the shit out of my country, they will eventually want peace.
Like, fuck all the way off.
Yes. Well, he did. He did fuck off to the Bahamas.
Yeah, what a tragedy. He got to go sit on a beach for a few years.
Yeah. Like, I don't like this man. I do think, by the way, that Guy Pearce is quite slick and greasy in this movie in a good way for this role.
Yeah, I'll be honest, the way that Edward and Wallace Simpson are written and the way the actors played off each other, I was like, I totally understand why these people vibe together, but I feel like they'd be fucking intolerable to be around.
In the party they gave at the whatever house it is, it reminded me in a way of the kind of party that Lee Miller would have, except that it was kind of on brand for them and not annoying, and this one was just annoying.
Yeah, definitely. And it definitely gave an opportunity for Bertie to show up with his wife, Elizabeth, and neither of them are very impressed by this party. Elizabeth is much more willing to be forthcoming about that than her husband is. I think they both could have come across as a stick in the mud in that situation, but you do get the sense that, their disapproval of this party is probably correct given the state of affairs.
I did enjoy Elizabeth's refusal to talk to Wallace and just going up to the king instead and then talking to Churchill about it afterwards.
Yeah.
So, in case you needed reminding about von Ribbentrop, he was German foreign minister from 1938 to 1945, but before that he was actually the ambassador to Britain in 1936 to 1938. Which is why he knew Edward, and personally too, and that's part of the reason why the Nazis thought he was a viable asset.
Yeah, we might have talked about von Ribbentrop in our Nuremberg episode, which you can go listen to because, spoiler alert, he had a bad time in the Nuremberg trials.
Yes, he did.
May 1937, Lionel prepares Bertie for the speaking he will have to do at his coronation. Bertie's advisors, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Derek Jacobi, attempt to push Lionel out of the picture by informing Bertie that Lionel has no official qualifications, like he's not a doctor or anything. And to be fair, Lionel has never lied about this. Bertie just assumed. So the two of them have a quarrel about this. Lionel manages to provoke Bertie into flying into a rage, during which he speaks perfectly. So they soon resolve their differences as they rehearse for this coronation. And it really cracked me up when I was watching the documentary. They were talking about how the archbishop, in a misguided attempt to be supportive, did a speech where he was like, "Guys, the king has a stutter, but you should all just chill and cut him some slack." And the king was like, "Bro, did I ask you to draw attention to it?"
That's also in the book, so I'm guessing most of this documentary stemmed from this book. And it's really just this archbishop in the movie is such a dick. But I did enjoy the fact that Lionel just sat down on the throne. That just he's like, it's just a chair. I can just sit on it. It's fine.
Yeah, it's very irreverent. Yeah, I like that the archbishop is just very representative of this very stuffy, old-fashioned establishment viewpoint on everything.
Archaic would be the word I would use.
Definitely.
It's September 1939. Britain has just declared war on Germany. Bertie and his family watch a newsreel of Hitler giving a speech, and he makes up his mind that he will successfully deliver a speech to the nation. It's kind of a nice parallel, except one is evil and the other one is not. Depending on how you look at it, I guess. Lionel helps Bertie to rehearse this speech and reminds him that he's nothing to be afraid of anymore because his father is dead.
Yeah, and this is a huge moment when you remember that Bertie's father, George V, had just become monarch before the outbreak of the First World War. So, a similar situation. And Bertie himself had served in the Navy during the First World War, including during the largest sea battle of the war, which was the Battle of Jutland in 1916. And he joined the RAF after the war. He became the first member of the British royal family to become a pilot. And all of this factored into why he initially opposed British involvement in another war and why he supported appeasement, because he had been in battle and he had seen men die. And he really became, probably the right king for the job, considering that he had battle experience. And then he went on to become a wartime king in the footsteps of his father.
There's actually a scene earlier in the movie where he breaks down and cries because he says, I'm a naval officer and that's all I know how to do. And I found it so moving. And I just the combination of him and Helena Bonham Carter is also, they are very good together. They such great chemistry. It's so nice.
Yeah, I'll point out too that his daughter Elizabeth served in World War II. She was an ambulance driver, and his younger brother, the Duke of Kent, was the first member of the British royal family to die in battle in like 450 years or something like that. He died in a plane crash.
Wow. How many brothers did he have? Because I got really confused about doing my research. It's quite a bit. And then they mentioned a brother that dies as well early on, probably when he was young.
Yeah, there's definitely a few. I'm glad that the movie just focused on
Yeah.
the oldest 2 brothers. I'm like,
Yeah.
then I don't have to keep track of other brothers.
No, it's really confusing. This family is large. By the way, the real that I see is actually probably the rally in Nuremberg, I think. Like the first big Nazi rally that was also heavily produced because Hitler invited like this director to direct this entire reel, and it's more like a propaganda movie than anything else. But I think it's interesting that they show it because it makes you realize that both of these men knew the value of production and of radio production in this case, in Bertie's case, but it's no different really than what Hitler was doing, just addressing his people, but in very different ways. And I like that they kind of showed you Hitler for a while too. He's also the very opposite in terms of physicality as Bertie was. Like, Bertie's really quiet, although he did yell, but not like Hitler.
Yeah, definitely. Lionel accompanies Bertie to give his speech, though he begins haltingly and like, man, I was reading about the speech that he gave in 1925 that the movie opens with that was the catalyst for him going to speech therapy. Everywhere that I read about it described it as it was difficult for him and everyone listening. So and I'm like, I totally get that because when he starts giving this speech at the end of the movie, he's quite halting and you kind of hold your breath for him. But he uses everything that he has learned from Lionel to deliver the speech successfully. It is heard all over the world. We see people listening to it on the radio, soldiers and civilians and all kinds. Bertie thanks Lionel for his help. It's a very sweet moment. You can tell that they're really good friends. And the British people cheer for Bertie and his family as they step out onto the balcony and we get the impression that he's being accepted as their monarch.
I loved this in the movie, how they kind of moved it all the way along until the very end. But Bertie was very appreciative of Lionel throughout the treatment and also earlier, like he gifted him a couple cool things like a cigar box in silver and like loads of fun stuff. And he also got a couple of awards or titles or I don't quite remember what, but it happened fairly early on in their friendship slash treatment. So I do understand why they waited in the movie to put that at the very end because he needed a bit of an arc. But it's just so sweet, man. I kind of enjoy. I love when friendships like this humanize a monarch in this case because they can be so much larger than life, and this way it makes it really small and personable, and that's what I enjoy about it.
Yeah, and I like that the movie leaves off on the very doorstep of really the thing that George VI is known for. Like him and his wife are known for being wartime monarchs, and so we're leaving off right at the beginning of the major symbol of their reign. So it's kind of like we just got all the backstory for that. And as you were saying, World War II did George a ton of favors in terms of his popularity because there was this whole thing at the time where the British royal family were convinced that if they told anybody anything in the newspapers, then it was going to be a whole thing. So the newspapers basically did not carry any stories about Edward's abdication until the last minute, like right before it happened. And when the people of Britain found out, they were broadly in favor of Edward marrying who he wanted and staying on the throne. Like everyone was very they didn't understand what the big deal was effectively. And yeah, so there was, quite a lot of people protesting on behalf of like, "No, don't take our king away," kind of thing. And I really think it was like we're in this era where people are flying across the ocean on airplanes and the golden age of Hollywood is starting and people are very much seeing the world modernize quickly before their eyes. It just feels so quaint and old-fashioned that the king can't marry some woman because she's been divorced before. And so, yeah, I think it took people perhaps a little while to warm up to George, but he and Elizabeth became symbols of support and calm during the bombing that Britain was soon to sustain, and it was a pretty big deal for them.
I also wonder because obviously a lot of what happens is kept quiet by quote unquote the firm. And I wonder if Edward's discretions, of which there were quite a few, were kept silent And so all the public saw really was this man who was not allowed to marry the woman that he loved, which sounds really mean, right? It sounds like a stupid thing to do. But I also think he had done so many other shit things that maybe he was kind of an embarrassment to them anyway. He just wasn't very responsible in being a king.
Yeah, and George V, I think he says this in the movie, but he'd also said it in real life that he knew that Edward was going to fuck up being king within the first year, and he was right. He just wasn't cut out for it, you know? Like, he was very good at the parties and the socializing and all that kind of stuff, but he very much wanted to do what he wanted and didn't want to conform to duty, and his younger brother, George, was ended up being quite the opposite of that.
Yeah, I would say that one is a wave maker and the other one very much is not. So they were just very different as people, and they kind of one fits the role of being the king of England, and the other one really just doesn't, just from a personalities perspective, maybe.
Right. And yeah, and as you say, they're definitely not telling the public that Edward is a big Nazi supporter. I mean, to a degree, obviously some of it is in the papers, like when he meets with Hitler and stuff, but you would want to definitely keep that on the down low because when you're going into wartime, you don't want to let everyone know that your royal family is compromised.
No, and it makes you wonder if, and I'm guessing he probably wasn't the only one, but you definitely wouldn't hear about it.
Yeah, and I think in their family too, like, their dad, George V, he was the one where during World War One, he changed the family name to Windsor because it sounded too German, and really went out of his way to separate the British monarchy from the German monarchy because George V and Kaiser Wilhelm were first cousins, and they were also first cousins with Tsar Nicholas of Russia. Like, they all shared a great-grandmother who's Queen Victoria, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And so he really did his best in public to strictly delineate, like, this is us and this is the Germans. And so to have his son be like, "Oh, I'm gonna actually team up with the Germans and, do this and do that and whatever," like, I really think that was a huge letdown to the family.
Just imagine if the SS had managed to carry out their operation and abducted Edward and put him back on the throne. Crazy.
Yeah,
But yeah, I don't know how realistic that was in the first place of the Germans to decide to, we're just gonna invade Britain. We're just gonna do that.
right. I mean, as we have definitely discussed before, that was on the agenda and ultimately did not work out, so
Nope. So we get some end cards because this is where the movie ends. We get King George VI made Lionel Logue a commander of the Royal Victorian Order in 1944. A high honor from a grateful king made Lionel part of the only order of chivalry that specifically rewards active personal service to a monarch. Lionel was with the king for every wartime speech, also after the one we see. Through his broadcasts, George VI became a symbol of national resistance. Lionel and Bertie remained friends for the rest of their lives.
that's the whole point, the friendship.
Friendship! Woohoo! Yeah, I enjoyed it. I really liked how they wrapped this story up so nicely. There's no open end, no loose ends. It's quite nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
We have some notes, a couple. One of the documentaries that we watched, or Sam watched after I was going to watch it and then didn't, is called On the Brink, World War II and King George VI, which is apparently a bit of propaganda for the British monarchy. But, you can watch it. It's on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some interesting stuff in there, and I watched another one that YouTube recommended to me afterwards that was I think it was literally called, like, The King's Speech, George VI and something something, so if you wanted to look it up, I'm sure you could easily find it. It tied in a bit more with the movie, but I think it very much leaned into this. I don't wanna call it a fallacy, but I feel like this, like, national myth of, like, the keep calm and carry on, stiff upper lip, like, everyone in Britain supported the monarchy and, like, everyone was behind the war effort, and I just think there's so much nuance, and then when you see a documentary that someone made about the monarch, you're like, "Okay, well, we're gonna get a certain point of view about the monarchy," and, I mean, that's what happens.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will also put both documentaries on the website so you can just look at them there. So, Elizabeth, George VI's wife, was actually monumental in the decision that she and George would not evacuate during the Blitz. They stayed at Buckingham Palace, which was then bombed in September of 1940, and she said something along the lines of, I don't know what the exact quote is, but I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel like I can look the East End in the face because the East End was bombed very heavily. And up to that point, Elizabeth had not the best reputation with the people because she wore expensive clothes and when she would go out, and she was kind of disconnected from them a little bit. But this quote and the fact that they stayed was really a turning point for both of their reputation, I think, with the people. And even though the British Empire began to decline and break apart under George's rule, he and his wife remained personally very popular with the people of Britain. So, like we said, the war kind of did them a favor. And they
Yeah.
also seem, at least from the movie, I can't really tell what they were like in real life because I've not read enough about them, but they seem to be kind people, at least.
Yeah, I mean, they did a ton of going out and visiting during the war, so they would go into bombed neighborhoods, and they would go to factories, and they would go to see the troops, and they would do a ton of that kind of, like, developing social capital, I guess. Yeah, people really appreciated that, I think, and people were very, they took it personally when the Germans bombed Buckingham Palace, like, to them, to people, that was a big deal.
Do not touch our monarchy. Get off.
Yeah, and if we wanna tie this back to our episode about the Indian National Army a few weeks ago, George VI was the last emperor of India.
Ooh, that's right. So, both Churchill and the king, talking about doing things that made them popular, actually wanted to accompany the troops to France on D-Day, but everyone else said, and specifically Eisenhower said, no, this is far too dangerous, you cannot do this. So they didn't go to the beaches of Normandy, but King George did visit Normandy, I think 10 days after the invasion, so he did go, just not on the day when they were doing the thing.
I was reading about this, and it cracked me up because initially they were both so gung ho that they were definitely going to be on a ship watching the Normandy landings. And then someone mentioned to the king, they're like, Well, have you thought about the fact that before you go on this ship, you will have to explain to your oldest daughter, at this point, like 20 years old or 22 or however old she was, they're like, "At this point, you're gonna have to explain to your eldest daughter how to choose her first prime minister, because if you and Churchill both go down, she will become the monarch, and she will have to choose a prime minister during a war." And then George was like, "Oh, fuck. I didn't think of that." So he was like, "Actually, no, I definitely can't go." And then he got on board with trying to stop Churchill from going, and Churchill was like, "I'd do what I want," because you couldn't tell that man nothing. But he eventually came around and was like, it's just it's too much of a risk, too much of a personal risk.
So what else did George do in the war? Well, he established a couple medals of his own, like the George Cross. The George Cross is for exceptional civilian bravery, and he awarded this to the entire quote-unquote island fortress of Malta in 1943. So he just went up there and was like, everybody gets a medal. Well, the entire island gets a medal.
Yeah, if you look at where Malta is situated in the Mediterranean, it was a major location for whoever had control of it had control of the airfield, and they could fly planes to wherever they wanted in the North African field of conflict. And so both sides really, really wanted Malta. It had huge strategic importance. And so of course got the absolute shit bombed out of it.
Imagine just going to an island and be like, this entire island is now deemed to have received the George's Cross. That's funny.
Hell yeah.
Another thing that made me laugh is it's post-war at this point. I think it's 1947. George goes on a post-war tour to South Africa, and he was told by the South African government that he was only allowed to shake hands with the white people, and he was apparently very appalled by this. And then he referred to his South African bodyguards as the Gestapo. I laughed so hard. Just imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like it's like, bro, they're like the king of the colonizers, but it's like this is the bridge too far. somehow. It's like, but we don't say the quiet part out loud.
Of course not. You can do the last note, the saddest note of all.
Yeah, it's the sad verse, everybody. George VI died of coronary thrombosis in 1952 as a result of the lung cancer that he had suffered from. He was 56. He had tons of health problems in his life. He was sickly even as a child, and then as he got older, he just had it was just compounding conditions, and he had an extremely stressful job, so that definitely didn't help the matter. It aged him significantly. Yeah, he passed away in 1952, and Logue died the following year. Representatives of the royal family attended his funeral, but the actual members of the royal family weren't able to come because they had had a recent death in the family, so they were still doing the like official royal mourning thing.
Can't mourn another person when you're already in mourning, apparently.
No, it's not allowed. One person at a time.
It's so sad. But anyway, yeah. I haven't gotten this far in the book. I do wonder what it says about all this. So eventually, I might put it on the website once I've finished it. It'll be this week, I promise. Actually, I can totally put it on the website because by the time this episode releases, I will have finished the book. So I'll put a recommendation on the website.
Nice.
We need to rate this movie, but before we do, I would like to remind you that you can follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and or please do both. You can send this episode to a friend.
Every time you send this episode to a friend, the entire island of Malta gets a medal.
Excellent. Give how many medals do you want them to have, Sam? They already have one.
Well, I've never met anyone from Malta, but I assume they, like me, would love to have a shiny medal.
Fair point. So do share this episode with a friend. And I guess now we're at the part where we have to rate it. I feel like we need to do a tongue twister for this. And I forgot to look them up because they're in the book as well. And I should have just written it down and I totally forgot.
Hang on, I'm gonna look up the thistle one.
The thistle one, it's impossible. You need to write it down for me because I cannot remember. It's really annoying,
Theophilus?
by the way. The tongue twisters they do in that movie, instead of just literally putting them down in the subtitles for me, they did a Dutch one instead, like a really famous Dutch one. So I can do the Dutch one, that's easy, but this one is hard.
It's longer, but I'll just put the first part.
I don't know how we're gonna make this out of 10, but we're just gonna say the tongue twister and then the amount of tongue twisters we think it should have, I think. I don't know what we're gonna do. You can start. I'm putting the pressure on you. What are you gonna rate this movie?
I'm going to rate this movie. Hmm, I'll give it a 7.8. Theophilus Thistle, the thistle sifter, sifted a sieve of unsifted thistles out of 10.
Oh my god, that was perfect!
Thank you. I didn't even practice. I broadly think it's well made. I think if you watch it, you'll enjoy it. It's well acted. I understand why it won all those awards. It's personally perhaps not my brand as a film, which is the only reason why I didn't rank it higher. I think probably most people would watch it and be like, yeah, this is your classic Oscar bait movie about a public figure. So yeah, pretty good. Perhaps just not my personal jam as a film. What about you?
I will rate it 8. Theophilus Thistle, the thistle sifter, sifted a sieve of unsifted thistles out of 10.
Yay!
That wasn't
Success.
too bad. I feel
And then
like
we could,
I struggle more with unexpected tongue twisters.
I mean, I think we should do a shot now.
I don't have one. But anyway, I rated it 8 because it is kind of my brand of film as far as biopics go. I think it was a good one. Don't really have any feelings about monarchy in general. And I just really enjoyed everything else about it. I think I would actually watch it again. I watched it with my mother. She really enjoyed it as well. So that was fun.
But yeah, this is absolutely a movie that I'm sure my mom liked. Yeah. I mean, she also quite likes Colin Firth, like the ladies do.
I mean, who doesn't? I mean, he's kind of old in this movie, but in his younger years, he's quite sweet.
Yeah, well, now he's moved into DILF territory?
Maybe.
I'm not saying for me personally, I'm just saying broadly.
Yeah, that's fair. I'll take that. I'll agree with that. Are you reading anything currently that we haven't yet talked about?
I am. I started The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan because we are less than a month out from the 82nd anniversary of D-Day, baby.
How far along are you in this book? I need to know because I also started this book like 6 months ago and then I stopped reading. But I've read up to I don't think for me D-Day has started yet.
Well, yeah, and I don't think D-Day starts till, like, the last third of the book, like, so much of this is, like, build up to D-Day. I'm only on page 22
Oh, then I'm actually further into the book than you are. I'm like at page 80.
for now.
But it's so good again. It's just like you were there. It's such a smart way of writing.
Yeah, I honestly don't think I've read a better history writer than Cornelius Ryan.
No, why did he have to die so soon?
I know, and just the fact that he put so much work into his books that it took him, like, 5 or 6 years to write a book. I'm like, I don't know how many more he would have cranked out anyway, but it does seem a shame that we didn't get at least a couple more out of him.
I'm not reading anything new. Well, I am still reading this one book, but by the time that this episode comes out, I'll have finished it and it'll be on the recommendation for this episode. So I don't know what I'm reading next. Maybe The Longest Day.
Yeah, we should
That
try
sounds
and
good.
you gotta get through it. You gotta get through it before we record the episode. Mandatory.
All right. Well, I should be able to do that for sure. What else is in our pipeline? Let's tell the people what we've got coming up.
Well, we are recording an episode on The Dirty Dozen pretty soon.
Yeah, so if you want to watch the movies or read any books related to it before the episode, do and then tell us what you think. And then for now, I'm gonna thank you for listening to yet another episode of Rosie. You can follow us wherever you get your podcast and rate us 5 stars or leave a review. And you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com, for more information. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.